In this video, we are looking at the economics paper 1 scope, preparing for this year's examination. We are going to look at the topics that we need to study. We are trying to come up with an exam strategy that you can use for your preparation. We are going to do a paper 1 revision using last year's 2023 November paper, and we are also going to do our essays in full so that you can see what you can expect and what you need to do. So when we are looking at our scope, here we have a scope for paper 1 and paper 2, but we are mostly focused on the scope for paper 1 because that's the paper that you're going to start in. You will see that we have two main topics that are going to appear in your paper 1. We have macroeconomics and economic pursuits. Now, the strategy that I usually give my learners is that you don't have to always study both of these topics. These topics, both of them are going to appear in your paper, but mostly your paper is going to require you to choose questions. So you can decide to study macroeconomics, and then when you are looking at your question paper, you are going to do only questions that pertain to macroeconomics. Now, in section A, I should warn you, you are going to have questions that are compulsory, and they are going to be the mix of the two. So if you are only focused on one of these topics, you might lose 1 or 2 marks here and there, depending on how your general understanding or general knowledge is looking like. But for the most part, by just studying one main topic, you can be able to pass the paper, because at least the questions are going to be split in half, if not more than. So you will be able to pass those questions, and then for the questions for the topic that you did not study, you can apply your general knowledge. Now, let's say that you are choosing to take or focus only on macroeconomics for a paper. Let's see how this is going to work out for you. So the topics that you're going to be focusing on your macroeconomics are circular flow, business cycle, public sector, and the foreign exchange. So underneath those subtopics, you are going to have things that you need to tackle. For the circular flow, we are looking at a flow diagram, the participants in the flow diagram. You are looking at national account aggregates and the multiplier. And then for the business cycle, you're looking at the features and causes of the business cycle. You are looking at the types of the business cycle, how to smooth the cycles, and the features underpinning the forecast. These are some of the topics that in my view, see that they are important, and you cannot go through this topic without knowing these things. So they are basically just your priorities. In your public sector, you're looking at the objectives and the problems of the public sector. You are looking at fiscal policy and the Laffer curve and the reason for public sector failure. And then when you go to foreign exchange, you are going to focus mostly on the reasons for international trade and correcting a surplus and a deficit. These questions or these topics are what, in my opinion, I think that you should focus on. If you focus on these, I guarantee you that you cannot walk into an examination mastering these questions as they are and you are failing the paper. Failing is out of the question if you can be ready for these questions as you are stepping into your paper 1. So now let's look into our question paper and see, if I have those questions in mind, what would I be able to answer? So in section A, we know that section A is compulsory. We have a multiple choice. In 1.1.1, I have a public sector question. It says a deliberate action by the government to increase the value of a currency is known as. How did I know that this was a public sector question? Because it's talking about an action by the government. So that's always the actions that are taken by the government, and my answer is revaluation, because they are increasing the value of the currency. In 1.2.2, it says the business cycle that lasts from 7 to 11 years caused by the changes in the net investment is known as the cycle. Now this is a business cycles question, and my answer is a juggler. This falls under types of business cycles. You can even find it in Mind the Gap. So if you know your types of business cycle, you would have been able to answer this question. 1.3.1 1.1.3 says the relationship between the tax rate and the tax revenue for the government is illustrated by the curve. Here we go, involving the government again, and that's when you know that this is public sector. From just our scope, you know that we are dealing with the Laffer curve, because that's the only curve that you saw in that scale, in that scope. So in 1.1.4 it says if the revenue of a marginal propensity to consume MPC is 0.6, the value of the marginal propensity to save will be. This is a question of the multiplier. So how do you calculate it? Say 1 minus 0.6 that they gave you, and it gives you 0.4, which means that my answer is 8. So that's MPCs. It's simple as that. Part of your circular flow. In 1.1.5 it says a limit on the quality of goods and services that can be purchased from another country is known as import. Now economic pursuits will start, because we are getting into the last four of the other questions. So this one from 1.1.5 to 1.1.8, this is where we are going to have economic pursuits, and the answer to this one will be D, which is import quota. These are the things that you can answer from general knowledge or just from just perusing, depending on how much time you've had. And then we are looking at 1.1.6. It says a growth and development strategy that was intended to halve the unemployment and poverty by 2014 was known as the, again, economic pursuits. And the answer is B, Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative for South Africa. In 1.1.7, we are looking at the government's broad approach to industrialization is set out in the, so the clue here could be the word industrialization, and in my options I see that if option D says it's National Industrial Policy Framework. So you can use general knowledge in that way by just matching them that way. That's if you are absolutely clueless when it comes to them. So in 1.1.8 it says increase in the population of cities and towns throughout the movement of people from rural areas is known as, from general knowledge you know that this is urbanization, or from geography knowledge if you are also doing geography as well. 1.2 will also be structured in the same way. Half will belong to macroeconomics and one to economic pursuits. 1.2.1 says autonomous consumption. What is autonomous consumption? It is H, a part of the household spending that is independent of the level of income. That's circular flow. 1.2.2 says monetarist approach. That is G, maintains the view that markets are inherently stable. That's the foreign exchange markets. And then in 1.2.3 is F, it's the requirement to give an explanation of one's own decision and action. Debt forgiveness is B, an organization or a country is released from an obligation to repay a loan. Economic union is going to be C, a cooperation between countries to adopt common monetary and fiscal policies. Capital formation is going to be I, the process of adding new assets such as machinery, equipment to the existing stock. 7, national research and development strategy is going to be D, that focuses on using science and technology to promote industrialization. And consumer price index is going to be A, an economic indicator that relates to the cost of living. So all of these things, half of them is macroeconomics, half is economic pursuits. It also has 1.3 where you are giving economics terms, and in 1.3.1 they say the withdrawal of money from a circular flow. Again, we are back to the topic of circular flow, and whenever money is taken out of the circular flow we call that leakages. So your answer to that one will be leakages. And then in 1.2.3, a summary of various indicators of the same type into a single value. So this is a question on indicators, and we are still in our macroeconomics, and the answer to this is what we call composite indicator or a composite indicator. In 1.3.3 it says the exchange rate is determined by the market forces with an intervention by the central bank. You will see that in the circular flow topic, you are dealing with markets there as well. And then this is going to be called the managed floating. And it's when you read about types of market, there's a topic there about types of markets or different kinds of markets there. In 1.3.4, it says the increase in capacity of the economy to produce more goods and services. This one you don't even need to be following into a different topic because it's economic growth, and as an economic student, the first thing you must learn the definition of, in my opinion, is economic growth. In 1.3.5, it says the process of natural resources into finished good, rather the processing of natural resources into finished products, and that is called manufacturing. Again, that is another term that if you're an economic student, you should have this one at the top of your head. It has to come as part of your general knowledge. And I would actually say the same thing about 1.3.6. It says the lowest interest rate charged by commercial banks to their best client. The answer to this is the prime rate. This again is one of those economics general knowledge. So long as you're doing economics or you did EMS before, you should know this. We are continuing with our exam strategy to study only microeconomics. It means that when you get to section B, you are going to focus on question 2 and question 4. In question 2, you are looking at microeconomics, and the first one in 2.1.1, it says name two factors of production. So this is in line with the circular flow model and the participants in the circular flow model. So in the factor markets, that's where you find your factors of production. And the two factors of production, you can name any two. I'm going to give you four. You have land, you have labor, you have capital, and you have entrepreneurship. So any of those two would have been the acceptable answer. I'm going to make sure that I link Mind the Gap in the description below for those of you who feel like you need to revise some of the things that you can't remember because you haven't done them in a long time. You will find Mind the Gap in the description below. It will help you with good summaries. In 2.1.2 says, why is the inflation rate high during the prosperity phase of the business cycle? Now, in the business cycle, we know that we have different phases in our business cycle, and one of the characteristics or one of the identification of the prosperity phase, we find that the inflation rate is high. In the prosperity phases where people have money and people are able to spend money more in goods and services, and the reason why inflation rate is high is because demand is high and therefore prices of supplies are increased. The higher the demand, the higher the price. So we know this as our golden rule when we're dealing with demand and supply. The more you demand something, the higher its price goes up. And the going up of prices, that's what we call inflation. So in the prosperity phase, inflation is going to go high. Whereas in the downside of the business cycle, we will have an opposite happening. In 2.2, we are looking at a graph. It says study the graph below and answer the questions that follow. We see that it's the South African trade balance graph. It's showing us money in rands in our y-axis and our years in our x-axis. 2.2.1 says identify the year in which South Africa recorded the highest value of exports. If you looked at our graph, you would have seen that basically in our graph you're looking for the highest bar graph, because on the y-axis we have our money going up, and you can see that the highest one would be in the year 2021. We have the exports which are shaded in black as higher than the rest. The 2.2.2 says name the account in which the balance of payments, that's the BOP, that records the portfolio investment, and that account is called the financial accounts. This is when you're going to look at into your national accounts, still in the same topic of microeconomics. And then it says briefly describe the term trade balance. Trade balance is the difference between tangible exports and tangible imports. The difference meaning we take our exports and we minus our exports. That's what we mean by the difference between them, and that's going to give us what we call a trade balance, meaning the answer of taking exports minus imports will give us what we call a trade balance. And then in 2.2.4 it says explain the impact of electricity shortages on exports volumes in South Africa. So we know that we are dealing with load shedding problems. So exports volume will decrease as production is reduced by power cuts, interruption. So that is a straightforward answer. Because if you think about it, when you imagine a production in a factory that is reliant on electricity to have the machine process, if they power cuts, then the machines don't work anymore. In 2.2.5, it says, how can the South African Reserve Bank reduce balance of payment deficit? They can do this by increasing the repo rate to reduce consumer spending, because the higher the repo rate, it means that there's high payments on your credit cards. And then discourage importing by making credit by commercial banks stricter. So basically, to reduce the balance deficit, we are trying to say we don't want our spending to be more than what we are making. So to do that, you reduce spending in whatever capacity you can. In 2.3, it says study the table below and answer the questions that follow. We have the national accounts for South Africa at current prices. We have items, and on the other column we have 2021 figures, and they are in R billion. So every amount that you see there is missing about 9 zeros. So 2.3.1 says identify in the table above the methods used to calculate gross domestic product. So our GDP. What is the method that we use to calculate our GDP? We have used in that particular one the income method. So make sure as part of your preparation you go study different methods of calculating GDP. And then in 2.3.2 we say give one example of taxes on products. So any type of tax that you can think of charged on products, or your import duties, excess duties, but the most common one that I think that you will be able to remember no matter what will be the value added tax. Remember that value added tax is a tax on consumption of goods and services. In 2.3.3, it says briefly describe the term subsidy on production. So when we say a company has been given subsidy on their production, what do we mean? What we mean is they have received financial support by the government to reduce the cost of their production. So every production, we know that we have costs of production, that electricity, those machineries. So whenever the government gives them grant so that they can reduce cost and be able to produce more, that's what we call production subsidy. In 2.3.4 it says why is it important for a country to prepare national account aggregate? So this is the national account aggregates that we saw in our in our information of 2.3. It is important because it helps us to measure economic growth by comparing real GDP figures for the current period and the previous period. So for most of them, you will see this one only showed us 2021 figures, but most of them usually will show you the previous 2 years so that you can compare as to how has the economy grown from the previous period to the next period. Hence, we are saying we are measuring economic growth. And then in 2.3.5, it says calculate the gross value added, that's the GVA, at basic prices. A in the table above, show all calculations. So when you go back to that table of incomes in our national accounts, you will see that our GVA is not been given. It says gross added basic prices. It just said A. So what you do is you start with your gross value added at factor cost, then you add your taxes on production, and then you minus the subsidies. Why am I minusing the subsidies? Remember, we just said subsidies, you got that money free from the government. So what the government is doing there is helping people, so they will minus that amount for their accounts. Then in 2.4 it says briefly discuss specialization and mass production as effects of international trade. This is for 8 marks. So what you need to do here is make sure that you give 2 points for specialization and 2 points for mass production. So let's start with specialization. Specialization increases the standard of living, especially when the specialized goods are in demand. Countries that specialize in specific products can produce them at a lower cost, thereby increasing their exports. Remember, this is the effect on the country's ability to export. And then in mass production becomes possible if foreign demand is added to domestic demand. Again, you will see that we are mentioning international trading there by pulling in the foreign demand. And then in point 2, producing in large scales increases employment and thereby improving the standard of living. So the effect basically is that it's earning us more income internationally so that the country's standard of living can improve. And then in 2.5 it says how can business cycles influence the use of fiscal policy in the economy. So fiscal policy, if you don't remember it, it's the policy that the government uses monetary figures in order to stabilize or help with the economy. So during downswing, the government implements expansionary fiscal policy to stimulate economic activity and reduce high employment, because in downswing it would mean that the economy is doing bad. So what we are trying to do is expand the fiscal policy, meaning expand the budget. The government will expand the budget so that they can stimulate economic activity and hire even more people. But in the upswing, the government implements restrictive fiscal policy to dampen the economy and avoid high inflation. As we've discussed before, when we are in prosperity, prices go up and inflation goes up. B, you would still have to choose question 4 as your second question. Reason being that question 3 would be on economic pursuits, whereas question 4 is both of them, so you would still be able to balance. 4.1.1 says name 2 characteristics of countries in the south. Countries in the south are mostly undeveloped and developing countries, so they are characterized by a low standard of living and a high unemployment rate, like countries such as South Africa and Zimbabwe. So it's undeveloped and developing countries. 4.1.2 says how can the increase in the population's income level influence the demand for imports? So how does our income as a country influence the demand for imports? How often are we going to import depending on the income that we are making? So as you can imagine, importing is more expensive than buying local. So it will increase the demand of imported goods as local consumers can afford more. So if we have more money, we will be able to pay those shipping costs, for example. Those shipping costs, import duties, all of those costs that are associated with paying for imports will be much easier if the population's income level has been increased. In 4.1, we have a supply side and demand side policy graph. On the y-axis, we have P that shifted to P1. On the x-axis, we shift from Q to Q1 to Q2. And then in the graph itself, our equilibrium points are also going to shift from E1, then to E2. And then questions. 4.2.1 says identify the original equilibrium point in the graph above. So we are basically saying the point before it moved, and that would be the original E. And then from there it moved to E1 and E2. Those are not the original points. The original one is E. 4.2.2 says name one instrument of monetary policy. The one instrument of monetary policy is the repo rate. Basically is the rate that the government or the banks can manipulate to have movement in the economy. And then 4.2.3 says briefly describe the term business cycles. business cycle is the successive period of increasing and decreasing in the economic activity. So this increasing and decreasing is what they will use monetary policies like the repo rates to make sure that to control the increases and the decreases. So that's what gives us the business cycle. And 4.2.4, it says, how can competition stimulate aggregate supply? So in business as well as in economics, we know that competition is actually healthy. Why? Because it encourages businesses to use more efficient production methods, thus increasing productivity. So the businesses will always want to do better than their competitors, meaning produce less at lesser cost and also charge lesser prices than their competitors. And then in 4.2.5 it says, explain the effect of demand side and supply side policies on the general price levels and real output with reference to the graph above. So we are going to go back to the graph above and explain while looking at the graph. So we are going to start with the AD graphs, meaning the demand side graphs. So implementing a demand side policy will stimulate the economic growth, which will shift the demand curve, meaning that's the AD graphs, from AD to AD1. So you saw that it moves from AD to AD1. And then because of this will form a new equilibrium at E1. So we would have moved from E to E1, which will produce higher output at Q1. So then our quantity moves from Q to Q1, and thus pushing the price level from P to P1. Then when we implement the supply side policy, the supply side policy will then be implemented to match the demand, which will shift the supply curve from AS to AS1. This forms a new equilibrium at E2 and an even higher output at Q2 and the general price of P. Then in 4.3 it says, study the information below and answer the questions that follow. We have a population demographics for South Africa in 2022. If you're doing geography, you are familiar with this population graphs, but we are just simply going to answer questions based on that. This is data response. On 4.3.1, identify the population percentage of females in the age group 30 to 34. So basically on the graph you're going to look for 30 to 34 age groups and then look for the side of the emails, and it's going to give you 4.7%. On the other side it shows you males at 4.8, but since the question only looked for females, the answer is 4.7%. In 4.3.2 it says, give an economic term that refers to the population age group from 15 to 65. This is what we call our economically active population. The other term for it is our workforce, because you are only allowed to work in those age groups. In 4.3.3, briefly describe the term life expectancy. So what is life expectancy? It is the number of years a newborn is expected to live. So from the age that you are a newborn to the time that you are expected to pass over. 4.3.4 wants you to explain the impact of malnutrition on the child mortality rate. Malnutrition increases health risks, thereby increasing the child's mortality rate. Mortality rate, we mean basically the death rate. So if you're malnutritioned, your death rate becomes higher. In 4.3.5, why is the population size important to businesses and or the government? So we are going to start the reason for government. It's important for the government because the government uses population figures to plan infrastructure projects, and then for businesses use population figures to determine the size of their markets. So basically, why do businesses and government need to know the size of the population in the country? The government needs to know how much of infrastructure project they need to budget for, whereas businesses need to know how much is their potential target market. In 4.4, it says discuss the Spatial Development Initiative, SDIs, as South Africa's endeavors efforts in regional development. So what are SDIs? SDIs they help to promote the sustainable industrial development in areas that have high rates of poverty and unemployment. They are owned through private sector by granting private businesses government incentives, so example subsidies. They stimulate economic activity in underdeveloped areas, thus promoting economic growth and development. They restructure the effects of the apartheid economy through the development of previously underdeveloped areas. So when you think of SDIs, we are thinking of basically initiatives that help with the development of our rural areas, for example. So those would be our underdeveloped areas. So underdeveloped areas, we're talking about our rural areas. So there are initiatives that are private sector initiatives, but they are subsidized by the government to be able to help our undeveloped areas in the country. In 4.5, it says analyze the relationship between the financial sector and other participants in the circular flow model. So the financial sector, will start describing what that is. It's the financial institutions such as banks that provides lending and borrowing services to other participants. Then getting to each and every single one of our participants, starting with households. Households borrow from them to buy goods and services such as vehicles and houses. And then the government borrows from them to cover public spending such as infrastructure. And then businesses borrow from them to finance their investments and expand their operations. So whenever you are asked to describe a relationship between participants, it's the simple thing that we did. The strategy here was basically we started by describing what financial sector is, and then we described how each and every single one of the other participants uses or connects with them. Households needs loans for houses and vehicles. The government needs public spending, and sometimes they run short on the budget, and then businesses have to do investments. You get to the essays in section C, that means that now you are also still going to choose an essay on macroeconomics. So in this paper, it would have been question 5. Now let's talk about our essay structure first before we get into the question itself. So what are you expected to do with your introduction? Your introduction, this part of the essay structure will also be in your paper, so it will come there to serve as a reminder of what you need to do in your introduction. Basically what you need to do is you need to define whatever term that they're asking you about. So for example, if your essay is on economic growth, the first thing you will do there is define economic growth, and then in the body you will now get into your subheadings. You should at least know subheadings in whatever topics that you choose that you will be able to discuss. In your conclusion, you will then get into your own opinion. Your own opinion starts with something by why is it important for, then that would give your opinion, because you will be telling us in your opinion why is it important for that thing to take place. So looking at our question 5, it's a microeconomics question. It says discuss in detail the main objective of the public sector in the economy. And then for additional part, it says evaluate the impact of privatization of the state-owned enterprises on the South African economy. So this essay is mainly, the 26 marks is on the public sector question. So in your introduction, what are you defining? You're going to simply define public sector. What is public sector? The public sector is all the entities in the economies that are owned and controlled by the state or the government. That's your introduction. That's it. It's finished. It's only 2 marks, so there's no point writing a long thing. And then when it comes to your body now, your 5 headings are going to be on discussing the objectives of the public sector. So the objectives of the public sector, we have 5 objectives of the public sector. So you are going to write them as your subheadings and underline them, and then under them you will need to discuss each and every single one of them. if you ever run out of information or you are unable to remember, it's not necessarily about the perfect definition, it's about you being able to discuss something under those topics. So for example, in the body, you're going to start by saying the main objectives of the public sector are. The first one is economic growth, and the economic growth, give at least 3 points that you can think of. Usually I'd say to my students that you need to give 5 points, but if you're pressed for time, don't give anything less than 3 points that you can remember about the economic growth, whether it's a definition, whether it's examples, and so forth. So as long as you can fill those 3 parts. And then for additional 10 marks, you have what we call the additional part, and that is on the impact of privatization on state-owned enterprises on South African economy. Now the question itself, it said evaluate. Whenever you see evaluate, it means we want positive and negative impacts. So you can give me 5 positive impacts and 5 negative impacts. All of these can be found easy in summaries on your Mind the Gap. Then going to our conclusion now. Remember our conclusion, we are talking about your opinion. You just don't use the word I. You will start the sentence by saying, why is it important for something to happen? So you could say, for example, in our conclusion, we said it is very important for the government to have clear objectives. This is us talking about the main topic. Also conclude on the main topic, not the additional part. The introduction is on the main topic and the conclusion is also on the main topic. And we started it by saying it is very important for the government to have clear objectives and focus on achieving them for the development of the country's economy. This is not a fact, this is just an opinion, this is my opinion. And so for your exam tip, if you start the sentence off, it is very important for, that means you are telling us, in your opinion, what is important, and that's a conclusion. To have YouTube recommend you more of my videos, be sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below.